Okay, welcome to episode 12 of Believers and Nonbelievers in Discussion. Today our topic is dishonesty or honesty, and this is based on a book by Dan Ariely called The Honest Truth of Dishonesty, and a documentary that is currently playing on Netflix and it's on Amazon, etc., called Dishonesty, The Truth About Lies. So I've got 4 people on the panel this time. I'm going to go from right to left, quick introductions, and then we'll let everybody sort of give a statement and then go into our normal discussion. So on my right is Summer Song, is an author on witchdigest.com, and she also has an app called Witch Digest. Elizabeth Moore is on my right, and she's been on one of our previous panels. Welcome. To my left, and on the non-believer side, is Joan Francis. She's a psychologist and member of IEAA, the Inland Empire Atheists and Agnostics, and Ananda Said from UC Riverside. She's a doctoral student in the Department of Psychology. So this one's going to be a little different because, a position statement on honesty versus dishonesty is, I think we're kind of all for honesty. So, but we'll just kind of say what we have to say and then just sort of get conversational from there on forward. So, Ananda, do you want to give it a start?
A position statement?
Bring your mic in a little bit closer if you could, please.
Sure. So I don't know if I have a particular position. I think it's a very interesting, complex issue. On one hand, I agree with individuals like Sam Harris and others who argue that in order to really have a good relationship with someone, you would need to be honest. To be dishonest prevents them from understanding you and prevents you from understanding them, from mental state reasoning with them. On the other hand, as someone who teaches critical thinking, I'm kind of, wrought with a cynicism about individuals' ability to handle honesty. And so for me, I find honesty and dishonesty very contextual. And so I don't know that I have a position other than I'd like to think that honesty is always the best course of action in every circumstance. I just don't know that living that as in a practical way is something that I have always been able to do or that I can reasonably expect of everyone else at all times.
Fair enough. I'm going to jump onto this side. Elizabeth?
Okay. So I do have a position here about the nature of humanity. So the Bible is the eye where I view the world through. My observations of behavior and nature are first filtered through claims made in the Bible. These studies proving humanity is deceitful in nature is not a shock to me. The heart is more so Jeremiah 17:9 says that the heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? Another verse, Ephesians 2:3.
We'll get a little bit more over here.
2:3 says, among them we too all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging in the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and we are by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. So when I was watching this documentary by Dan Ariely, I immediately thought, well, the Bible says this, that we are deceitful by nature. And also, it's interesting, in his documentary, he shows that the moral code, when presented to people prior to testing, seemed to prevent cheating. So when people were reminded to be honest, they were honest. And so this is another thing we also see in the Bible about fellowship and encouraging one another to do good works and to love and be kind. And so these reminders help us to be honest in daily living. And so I do have a few thoughts here. My position is that I was more looking at the dishonest nature of humanity not being able to be solved. There's no solution to it. It's simply a fact that people will be dishonest, and that the only answer to it is redemption found in the Bible. So that is the way I'm viewing this.
So you find a lot of syncing between what his research
Right,
found
his
and
studies
what the
seem
Bible
to-
teaches,
yes.
basically. Okay. Joan, back over to you.
Okay.
5 minutes,
Thank you.
please.
Otto
Sorry about that.
Warmbier, the 21-year-old college student who was seen stealing a political poster in Pyongyang, North Korea, was arrested and convicted and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. He was sent home 18 months later in a vegetative coma and died several days later. Now, how many of us have done a devious thing, a mischievous thing, a dishonest thing, and gotten away scot-free with it, or gotten off very lightly? So if being devious is universal, then dishonesty is universal, but how dishonest do we endorse dishonesty? And, what if you murder someone? What if you torture someone? What if you not rob someone of their life savings? Is that a viable form of dishonesty that we can endorse? And where do we get our consciences from? And is deviousness or dishonesty hardwired, or is it learned? Is altruism and protectiveness hardwired or learned? Of course, what role does religion play or not play in morality? Can you have morality with and without religion? Is there a difference in morality, the level of morality between liberals and conservatives politically? So when I was in high school, one of my teachers talked about an Indian legend where the conscience was a square hard disk inside of us that spun around when we did something wrong. And it really hurt at the beginning, but as it continued to spin, the edges got rounded and transgressing no longer hurt. And that's kind of a model that syncs with the reality of, as we continue to do dishonest things, we don't really hurt that much. It doesn't really bother us that much. And what role do our parents and our teachers and our peers have in directing us towards morality or immorality, honesty or dishonesty? And what role does genetics have in orienting us to honesty or dishonesty? The antisocial personality, highly dishonest, habitually lying and cheating. The narcissistic personality, I'm the greatest, I deserve everything. What role do genes have in predisposing them to that? We know, for example, that babies will cry. This is a few months old. They will cry, and then they'll look around to see how it's affecting everybody. And then if it is, they'll go back to crying. Okay, so they really haven't learned it at school, So maybe this is an indication that dishonesty is innate and faking people out is innate. Okay, that's about it. Yeah.
And I know you've got a little bit.
I do have a little bit more, but I don't want to get cut off by you.
Well, I just want to say you'll have an opportunity to
Okay.
add it down the road if you want, if you wish. So that's fine. Thank you for that. Summer, over to you.
Okay. So when I was a child, my parents scolded me for lying. They said it was bad to lie and that I should never tell a lie or be dishonest anyway because that's what bad people do. This was followed by confusion for me as I watched my parents' example regarding lies when I saw them tell lie after lie. So that left me in conflict and to my own devices to determine what I think is right or wrong. I believe that humans have a duality in their nature, and this is the duality of being both concrete and abstract. And I translate this in terms of physical and spiritual. Dishonesty and honesty is abstract, as I believe all thought is abstract, and the actions on these thoughts make it physical or real. I believe that our personal moral code or our moral compass is based on our interpretations of our perceptions of our experiences, including our childhood influences. I believe that we equate acceptable and unacceptable behavior as good and bad behavior, while deep down in our core beliefs, we may be in conflict with what we are told is acceptable or unacceptable behavior. And this is how we can have our own moral compass, although we parrot external moral codes that can be in conflict with our personal moral judgment. And this brings me to the conclusion that everyone lies and everyone is dishonest.
Okay, everyone lies. Now, there's a couple of you, or three of you, I think, have said essentially that dishonesty is a big part of us. And what I find interesting from Ariely's book and some other stuff is that I want to get into the degree of this. You know, how much of this is normal. I mean, you know, on one hand, we could say that everybody's a horrible person by default and does this all the time, and on the other hand, we could say everybody's reasonably good, and the lying is only a smaller portion of your day. So, what are your impressions on where we are in that balance? This is for anybody who wants to step in.
I think where we are in this balance is coming to terms with how we feel about certain lies, or like the little white lies that we tell, the things that are justified, like, oh, if we want to have a surprise party, you know,
Yeah.
that's a time to lie because you don't want the other person or the subject to find out the lie. So, you know, you don't want them to find out about the party until after it's started.
These
So
are
you
morally
lie.
acceptable lies.
So it's a morally acceptable
Yeah.
lie. I think there's a lot of times we're dishonest with ourselves. And to be honest with ourselves means we have to admit that, oh, we're dishonest. So I think that's how it comes into that.
Well, I think it depends on the type of dishonesty we're talking about. So if we're talking about the intentional, so to be deceptive is to intentionally mislead someone. I think that takes more conscious effort. And so I think that's probably far less of what we see in our daily lives. I think we're far more likely to convince ourselves unconsciously, consciously, that what we believe or want to believe is true. And I think that's a much more ingrained part of our everyday existence and a very big part of our relationship formation and relationship maintenance. And I'm not sure how I would really place I wouldn't necessarily put a positive or negative on that, without thinking about a particular case. But I do think that intentional deceit, and if we're then add another layer of maliciousness, I think that antisociality is less than maybe than that kind of everyday, you know, wanting something to be true and telling ourselves that it's true, whether that's conscious or unconscious. I want to be on time to this. I probably won't be on time. I wasn't on time today, but I told myself I was going to be on time, right? Just kind of like that unconscious stuff, I think is much more of the type of dishonesty I think we're actually experiencing than that intentional deceit.
Well, I think there are levels of dishonesty where dishonesty is morally the right thing to do. For example, my father, who was the chief interpreter for the immigration department, knew of situations where people had immigrated from Nazi Germany who lied. They said they were divorced, and they weren't divorced. They were separated, and they lied. And he said, "I'm supposed to tell them. Am I going to tell them? Of course not. I mean, these are victims. These are refugees." And in many refugee situations, you know, it is better to lie. It is the moral thing to lie because people are escaping something terrible. People coming from South America where they're subject to violence, you know, and they tell lies. Is it moral to tell the absolute truth, or is it more moral to look the other way, you know?
Well, but to not tell the absolute truth means that the absolute truth isn't available for public consumption.
Correct.
So then changes can't be made. So in that kind of case, I don't know. I think to lie about what's actually happening means that we can't adjust for it. So I get that for the individual person, it's adaptive to lie in that circumstance because of an immediate consequence. But then we can't make a structural change. And so that's why if I have to really think about honesty, dishonesty, I agree with individuals that say that honesty is always the best policy even when it hurts, or it doesn't seem immediately to be the case. I don't know. Sorry, that was my initial reaction to that.
So you shut up in relation to that person, but you open it up in the abstract.
Maybe, I don't know. That sounds like a very difficult job that your father had. a very difficult position to be in. I want to say that he should always have been vocal about it so that we knew what individuals were experiencing and what the consequences of those experiences were in real time. But I don't know. I'm not in that position. I can see how he would have a dilemma.
It is a tough one. I mean, Sam Harris has a book. It's one of his most recent ones. It's a short book, but his thesis is basically that he has come to a decision that lying is bad at all times under all circumstances. Now, this is an extreme position. I don't honestly know if I agree or disagree with him, but any thoughts on, you kind of touched on that a little bit. Any thoughts on this side of the table on that concept?
Go ahead. Okay, so I was, for me with lies and believing in the Bible as God's word, it's basically if I see anything in life that seems dishonest and goes against that, I would want to avoid it. So it's more of I've got this moral code book, and if it's not something that is, I guess, endorsed by the book or something that Christ has said, then I believe it's dishonest, or in that way, I don't know, because the Bible doesn't really talk about every single lie, but I do believe it says not to lie. So in my belief, it's that honesty is always the best policy, or basically that route for a majority of things.
What about, and what comes to mind is in Islam, I honestly can't remember if it's in the Quran or the Hadith, where they are basically given permission to lie to protect the faith or people in the faith. Does that go too far? I mean, if you're going to base your decisions out of what the Bible tells you, if a lie serves maintaining that moral
Right.
behavior or whatever, would that be justified?
No, so I can't speak for the Quran, and I understand there's a lot of different religions.
Well, from
That will-
the Christian perspective.
Right, so from the Christian perspective, the Bible says to not lie. So it would constantly be just don't lie. And so this is where I think humanity needs to have some founding moral code that is equal across the board. Otherwise, we're just always going to have this weird subjective morality.
You mean equal across cultures and
Cultures, yeah.
worldviews.
Right.
I'm going to tell you a story. When I was 25, I'd never really drank or been so drunk all the time that I really understood what being drunk was. So I went out, I told my husband, I want to go out drinking tonight. Would you go with me and kind of help me along? He said, no, but I'll send somebody with you. So he did. And I had one drink. It had a profound effect on me. And my designated driver decided while we were in the store was going to do donuts in the parking lot. So obviously got attention of the police, and the police came and said that the designated driver did not have a driver's license. I didn't know that. So the rest of the group was drinking, and I had had a drink, and I couldn't tell you if I was drunk or too drunk to drive. So when the officer asked me, I said, I don't know. I don't know if I've drank too much to drive. I don't know what it would be. I don't know what it's like, so I don't know. And he arrested me for being drunk in public. So going back on that, I think I wish I would have lied and said, no, I'm not drunk.
Yeah. So
So that's kind of, there are times when you think, should I have drank? I mean, should I have lied about drinking? Should I have lied about what I think? And there are times when I think there might be a good time to lie. So I don't think that the extreme of never lying is good, because there are times also, as a witch, I have been in circumstances where I had to conceal that I'm a witch because it could have been dangerous for me, And so there are times that I feel I have to lie.
yeah, and I think everybody up here is aware of that in terms of discrimination between worldviews. That's one of the reasons we do these panels, actually, to try to get people familiar with each other and reducing violence between worldviews is a big part of what we're after here. Go ahead.
Well, I think the paradox that you're describing is that even if you're willing to be honest, and you have a certain set of understanding of a certain circumstance, that the person you're being honest with may not share that same understanding, and so will react to your honesty in a way that may not be consistent with your expectations. And so I think that's part of the paradox, and why what Sam Harris suggests, though it sounds really appealing, I also feel torn about whether or not that's a reasonable thing that I could do. Because what you have to do in that circumstance is assume that that other person has full understanding of what you have understood as being the situation. And I don't think that's always the case, and I think over time you learn to not necessarily trust that that's the case. And so I think you just, like, your story is a good highlight for why I think that's a difficult thing, why we struggle with that.
And I think that's a good, that was my best example for not being so extreme, like on that extreme side of being honest all the time. Because there are times when you could really hurt someone's feelings, you know, and it's really not something that you need to tell the truth on. Or, you know, like, oh, does this make my butt look big? Of course you're not going to say that, right? Unless the person is expecting you to tell them the truth. Sometimes people don't want to be told the truth. Sometimes they want to be lied to. They want to have their little story, you know, edged on and continued. They don't want the truth.
And the difference between not telling people that you're a witch and if asked, what is your religion, you know, what do I say? How do I get around this one without saying that I'm a Wiccan or whatever witch supporting religion that is part of? You know, the evasiveness versus the blatant lie, or the little things that we tell our kids. A lady, I just read a piece written by a lady whose son came up to her and said, "Mom, what's a pimp?" Her decision at that point was, if I don't tell him, Siri will. So she had to tell him something. Yeah.
Okay, quick, somebody call up Siri and ask. I want to know what this is.
So I actually think you bring up a really interesting question, which is that, is it moral to allow someone to lie to themselves? And I'm inclined to say that it's not. But I'm open to discussion on that.
To themselves
Because I don't know.
is an interesting statement, because lying to yourself is that's self-deception, and essentially by concept that's not being self-aware that you're doing it.
Well, but in the case of the friend, you're asking your friend to be complicit in that self-lie.
Okay.
so then it's an extension. I don't know. Sorry, I just think it's an interesting question. So that came out of that.
Okay, I'm going to jump over to Dan's book for now, because we basically have two different categories here. What he is talking about in this particular presentation is unintentional, you know, on stuff that we're doing that's unaware, and he does most of his research on cheating, but we can really look at cheating, deception, and lying as sort of the same sort of, you know, moral lapses or that sort of thing. So, and then as opposed to intentional cheating and things that we do purposely that we're aware of doing. So let's put this onto the unintentional side and cover that subject for a bit. For the audience who hasn't seen the documentary, the core of it, a little bit of a spoiler, is that he found that people will cheat when given the opportunity, but not a lot. They will cheat to a small degree. My impression was that when I think of the Christian sort of broad idea of people are inherently bad, that seems more extreme. So I found this finding tempering that a little bit. What were your thoughts when you watched? Because you watched the documentary and started
Right, thinking about all
suggesting it. So.
Yeah. So the way I see it is that all sin is equal according to the Bible. So even if it's just a small level of lying, it is still deceitful. It's kind of any sin you do, it's all equal. So there's no levels in the Bible.
So small sin is equivalent to a large sin?
Yes.
I'm going to sort of disagree with that, but I'm not the one who's a panelist. So
Well,
does anybody wanna-
it's because we're guilty of sin that a savior was sent. And so even though I'm still capable of sinning, it doesn't mean I'm condemned or anything like that. And there are different extremes we can view it as, but as far as the way God views it, that sin is the same. So, yeah.
So that doesn't. Okay. Any
Yeah.
response over here on that?
To the theological interpretation. I mean, I don't know that I'm qualified to comment on theological interpretations. I personally do not see a need to use the Bible as my benchmark for interacting. We're a social species, and so as social individuals, we set norms for our expectations of behavior. And so, I mean, do I think that there are levels of dishonesty that have varying levels of consequences? Yes. I think there are different levels of consequences for different types of lies. I'm not sure what we're looking for here.
No, I'm just throwing it over to you to see if you have anything to say. I'm not looking for anything in particular. So, okay. I'd asked everybody to have some questions, so let's sort of grab one and toss it out. And
I will add that there's varying levels of complexity of deceit, even in children. And so as children get older, they become more sophisticated in the types of strategies that they use to deceive other people. And so I think in that sense, not only are there varying levels of consequences for dishonesty, I also think that there's varying levels of the strategies we take in order to deceive others.
Okay. Did you have a question for the panel or something to throw out?
Based on our current discussion. Okay.
No, just based on.
Yeah, I
what you
actually
prepared.
I do want to know what each person thinks about the morality of permitting the lives of others, not only to oneself but also to other people.
I'm sorry, permitting the lives of
Well,
others?
I guess being complacent in an individual lying to themselves. I think that's I mean, it is a funny question, but I have this as someone who researches how individuals learn science and religious concepts. As someone who understands the scientific process and what information is considered more scientifically valid or not, when individuals have a certain perception of how they want the world to be, and they continue to live in a way that, implies that what they want to believe is true, I struggle with whether or not I should share that information with others because of the emotional consequences. So I guess, from your perspective, do you think that if someone is lying to themselves, it's always your burden to share that with them? Or, I mean, I guess kind of generally, what do you even think of that topic?
Well, I don't think you should just say things. I don't think everything needs to be said. So the person has to be receptive, first of all. So to really go into things and so that you don't feel like you're lying and telling someone else something about whatever, a lie or whatever. I don't feel it's necessary to be honest about things by just saying what's on your mind all the time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's definitely a time and place.
Okay, I have a situation, or numerous situations as a clinician, when I was dealing with suicidal individuals who I knew were or suspected were religious. And I would often ask them, what do you think God would think of, your suiciding? Now, I didn't say that I believed that God thought blah, blah, blah. I was not lying. But I was drawing from there what, in my opinion, is self-delusion or self-deception. And invariably...
Self-deception because
I don't believe in God. To me, that's deceptive. That is, they are deceiving themselves.
that they weren't following what they thought God should.
No,
that they believe in God at all.
That the belief in God, having a personal thought about whether they should or should not suicide at that point, that to me is just not valid.
Okay.
Okay, but I asked them. So I made use of their belief, which I don't think is valid, to help them to step back from suicide. And it worked. It worked. In all cases where I tried it, at least for that period of time, and hopefully forever, they could kind of reprocess and life would go on, and they did not suicide. So I was complicit in what I considered to be their self-deception for what I considered to be the greater good.
So you were triggering a tool set that they had available to them.
Yes.
For a positive outcome. Yeah. I heard something over here.
Oh, no, I was just
Something
clarifying
down
her thing, but I don't really have anything to add to that. I don't think it's okay to join in someone's self-deception. But then again, some people might think someone's deceiving themselves when they may be wrong. So there's a lot of different variables there.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And this is actually for you. Do you feel that everyone has a moral code without being told what it is or what it should be?
I believe everybody's born with this innate feeling that there is a wrong. As we live our lives and we tell these smaller lies, we might be less susceptible to that moral code. We start changing it as society changes. It becomes very ambiguous. So I do feel that in a perfect world, you would have one set moral code that isn't going to change with society as time moves forward and people decide that things are different, or now this is moral even though then it wasn't, that sort of thing.
This is a really interesting subject, and I will say we're going to do a morality panel in a couple months. And this is one that's been due, so we're going to get into some detail of it because the questions are really just really interesting, and it does affect how you, I guess, decide to make decisions and what your actions are. So, okay, Joan, did you have anything that you wanted to pull from what I cut you off before of? Or did you have any other questions?
Not so much that, but something. I was also a prison psychologist for some time, and I worked a lot with murderers and other heavy-duty felons, and a whole lot of them, just decided that they believed and had given their lives over to Jesus because they felt that now they were saved and they wouldn't go to hell. And I was a little bit dismayed about that. Not their conversion, but the reason for their conversion, and the thought that that kind of erased all the horrible things that in many cases that they had done. Not every murderer, not every felon is actually a horrible person. There are some people who are actually forced into it by a number of dire consequences. But the vast majority of these people are not nice people. They're not people you really want to have as your next door neighbor. And they've suddenly jumped into this, being saved by Jesus. What do you guys think about that?
I got an answer for that. With my second husband, he wanted to be good. He was an ex-convict, and he wanted to be good. And I thought, oh, everybody has that opportunity. He wants to be good, so he'll be good. And I found that not everybody are capable of that, even though they want to be. And I feel that sometimes, like when my brother was in prison, he found God too. And it is a way for them to try to be something like everybody else that they're really not. And I think that happens sometimes with people who don't feel guilt or remorse. And I think they really want to be good, but they don't know how. They don't have that inner voice that tells them what's right and what's wrong, because they don't have those feelings. And I don't know if it's something that they were born with or whatever, but some of these people, they turn to God because they can't do it themselves. They can't fit into what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior in society, and they don't know how to do it without God. And I think that's why they do it.
Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because in the Bible, I'm not Christian, but in the Bible, Philippians 4:13, it says that I can do all things through God or through Jesus who gives me strength. So a lot of people, when they find God, they find that strength through their belief. And I think for some people, they can be good for a while when it's not their nature, but eventually they go back to their nature.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
So out of curiosity, you don't even have to use them. You don't have to tell me this, since it's a personal story. What kinds of behaviors was he engaging in that we're considering not good, and what do you think some of the factors were and why he committed those behaviors? Were they monetarily driven? I mean, I'm just curious.
With his nature and the way he was, it was his personality. He was very, he couldn't do things without manipulating someone. That's how he interacted with people, was to manipulate them in some way, either out of money or to get them to do something that he wanted them to do, or he was doing drugs, and so he didn't, he lied to cover that up. And I think that a lot of what he had to do with his mental illness. I don't know specifically what it would be, but I think it had a lot to do with that. The way he was raised. His mom had told him, had used the police to correct him or whatever. And I think he knew what was right and what was wrong, but he had a hard time doing it because he didn't feel it was actually wrong. He didn't see anything wrong with it.
So then, would you say that he had a good relationship with family members or a poor relationship with family members?
For that family, I would say he had a good relationship with them, although I wouldn't say it was healthy.
Okay. Just because, for me, in trying to understand why people behave the way they do or think the thoughts that they think, it's really important to understand what that early environment was. Because if that individual doesn't have a embedded social group where they feel like they're part of an in-group, they feel a responsibility to that in-group, then I think for them, what we would normally consider to be wrong, they don't have that group of individuals that they're responsible to. And so I don't know if I would say that it's some kind of inherent nature for an individual so much as understanding, what their social life is like, and understanding whether or not they have individuals that are support systems for them, that they feel close to and that they feel responsible for. I know that I don't want to get too much into the moral discussion, just trying to, if we're looking at kind of the moral understanding of children, it's very much about an in-group, out-group distinction. And if an individual doesn't feel like they have an in-group, then there isn't, for them, what we would consider poor behavior, isn't to them because they don't have that in-group. So
you guys are really bantering around the nature versus nurture argument. Now,
And also the environmental influences. I mean, if you're a kid who lives in a neighborhood where gangs are the way to survive, that becomes the good thing to do.
because that's your
That's the
in-group.
in-group.
yeah,
But
I would
also-
consider that nature because basically it's everything, every input you have, basically.
Nurture.
Nature. Nurture,
If you're in a peer group-
nurture being what you're born with, nature being your peer group, everything
The
you
environment.
experience, everything you're taught, the environment, all those, everything else, basically. Anyways, so are,
Okay.
that's
Okay.
the way
Wait,
that's
sorry.
how I say it.
So nature, the environmental. So nature is the environmental input. Nurture is the environmental input, and nature the genetic.
It's the genetic.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
biological
yeah.
predisposition. But also for Dan, his work is very much where what he finds is that people will be more or less dishonest depending on the context in which that dishonesty is occurring. And so
Yes.
if we're going to go with and talk about anything that's considered good or bad, whether it's dishonesty or not, any type of moral good or moral bad behavior, it's very much contextually bound, and I think his work demonstrates that as well.
So it is contextually bound, but everybody has this sort of software set, if you will. to take advantage at certain times to a certain degree, which reminds me of the, what was it, the equilibrium in nature. I mean, it's, maybe either of you two can say something about how behavior balances, game theory, tit for tat, interactions, altruism versus taking advantage of somebody.
So we're talking about the threshold, sort of.
Okay, you use the right words. I'll use.
No, I don't know. No. Your words
I'll
are good
use
too.
the way people, the klutzy words. So
So,
what's the current status of thought on, or maybe explain that concept to people who aren't familiar with it then better than I just
So I
did.
think the argument is that dishonesty to some extent is adaptive in certain circumstances. So I'm trying to think of an example from his documentary or his book or any of his studies, but the argument is that to be dishonest is to some extent adaptive, but it becomes maladaptive when you're too dishonest, and that starts affecting relationships, or other people become very bothered by it. And so people will lie just a little, just enough to get away with, where it's not really hurting anyone so much. And that's why for him, he finds that people who really take advantage of systems, who are, freeload to a great deal, those individuals are far less, because they're more likely to be caught, and the consequences are more extreme. But if it's just a little bit, and everybody else, 70%, are all also taking just a little bit more than they should, then you haven't, you're less likely to get caught, and so it's not as maladaptive.
What I got from what Dan was saying was not so much that people compare themselves to others and see, well, how much are they cheating? I really can't cheat. I want to cheat a little bit, but I don't want to cheat more than they do. I think what he was saying is I would feel bad about myself if I were a big cheater, rather than I'm going to get caught if I'm a big cheater.
That was one of the factors that he mentioned that would prevent you from cheating more than you would.
Yeah.
The justification.
Thinking, I want to think of myself as a good
That,
person.
oh,
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm kind of merging kind of the evolutionary arguments with what Dan's findings are when I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
I do think there is that feeling that too much. But I think part of what gives us that feeling bad when it's too much is because I think the fear of getting caught increases, even if that's not like the conscious part of it.
Yeah.
You're taking too many
deterrent.
cookies from the cookie jar, someone might notice. And so now I really do feel bad. I've only left 2 cookies. I don't know. I think they're wrapped up. I think they're intertwined.
Yeah, there were a lot of interesting little factors, because you would develop some guilt. There was differences in if you would cheat inside of groups, or if you would cheat in a way that would benefit another person. If you're socially interacting with these, I do recommend reading his book because it's interesting. It's one of these books like reading about biases where you kind of it makes you aware of sort of some of these dynamics that are in your head that you may not normally know that's going on, and it's going on in everybody to some degree. Now we can kind of toss off for as far as this subject is somebody who's really got a personality pathology, because that's not, that's pretty obvious when you've got someone who is, like a Jeffrey Dahmer
Outlier.
kind of thing. The outliers. We're not talking about those people, because I think we're pretty much in agreement that those people don't have the same tool set. Anything?
Do you want a question?
Throw up a question from your.
All right. Well, this one would change the subject. Let's see. Okay. Do you feel or believe that the difference between dishonesty and honesty are strictly black and white? Do you think there's a gray area, or is it just for you black and white? You're either lying or you're honest. There is no in between.
For anybody.
For anyone.
Well, the gray area might be when you're being dishonest, but you're not actually aware of the dishonesty. It's not like a conscious awareness. So when you're mistaken, or when you've just convinced yourself that you're not being dishonest. I mean, if we want to call it a gray area or call something a gray area, then it probably lies there. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
I was thinking more by way of evasiveness or omission would be kind of a gray area.
Oh, okay. So commission or omission. Right? Okay.
Explain that a little bit more.
So that's intentionally misleading someone by acting in a way or expressing something that would be dishonest or misleading. The converse would be knowing that something is wrong or something terrible is happening and just allowing it to continue.
Did you have anything you want to throw up?
I guess there's two viewpoints. I can see that in society we have gray areas where we might think this is a good lie or that sort of thing, where we know it's not true, but we think it's going to help in some way. That could be a gray area. Biblically, I think it's pretty black and white. Yeah.
Okay. So let me switch over to intentional cheating and deception. Let's go down that road for a bit here. There are cultural elements that make dishonesty or cheating more likely to happen than others. So this is something that has to be. I mean, there's always room for improvement. So, what can you think of that might be a cultural thing that we can improve on to reduce dishonest behavior or cheating?
I think that one of the biggest things is thinking of others prior to thinking about what's going to benefit you. We're a very prideful and self-focused society, very selfish society. Make yourself happy or whatever, do whatever makes you happy type of deal. I think if people started thinking more about the people around them as being more important or as being valuable or more valuable, it could kind of stunt some of this dishonesty because we wouldn't be wanting to affect them in a bad way. So if we just focused on others being other-centered, it would definitely improve society.
That's a good answer. I agree with that. Anybody?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, it makes me think of George Lakoff, who's a cognitive scientist and deals a lot with politics and how politicians frame issues. He sees conservatives as operating morally within their concept of morality from a strict father model. You know, you do this, you lift yourself up by your bootstraps, you're rich because you worked at it. You know, you get to keep your money, and keeping your money, you provide jobs for the rest of society, versus liberals operating from a nurturing parent morality, thinking of others. Everybody deserves health care, everybody deserves food, everybody deserves housing. So that, you know, these are, and each of these groups, the individuals within the groups, think of themselves as being moral from their framework. So.
Okay.
You know,
well, to speak to that though, so when I'm saying this about helping others, I'm talking about the individual needing to do that. A lot of liberals might say other people need to help others more. I'm saying focus on yourself and what you can do for the people around you, as opposed to, you know, everybody deserves something. It's more of, you know, you do it. You as a single person do what you see you want to be fixed. Go and fix that.
Thinking of others would implies not imposing on others too, I would think, too, then, to some degree.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, again, we mentioned different worldviews and belief systems, and there's certainly the more and less extreme examples of people in the world that are trying to impose onto others. So if thinking of others in terms of honesty, like, you know, empathy, for example, would
Right.
help you not want to treat another person badly. Now I'm losing my train of thought here.
Okay, so the working in insurance, there can be a very greedy side to that, where you want to sell the person as much as possible and get them to buy as many policies. So if I don't want to be that greedy person, I want to think of others first. I would think of their situation and what fits them. I'm not going to force them to purchase more insurance than they need. I would go with their individual thing and not try to scare them or fearmonger into buying more.
Yeah.
Well, so the question, can you repeat it? Because you were asking what we can do culturally to decrease dishonesty. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is just, I mean, everything I say is just my personal thoughts on this. But if we're thinking about it systematically and culturally, then I think that as a society, we put a great deal of emphasis on personal responsibility as opposed to the environmental factors that lead individuals to think the way that they think and to act the way that they act. And so I think that when people are confronted with a situation that they may not be competent in, that there's a desire to be defensive. Because if they're not competent in that area, well, that must be my personal fault, as opposed to a systematic issue. And so I think one thing we can do potentially as a culture is try to shift from that personal model, that personal responsibility model, and more to looking at the collective causes of why people are the way that they are. So, if even if one of my students is cheating, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. They're cheating for a reason. Is it because they have pressure at home? Is it because, they don't have enough money? And so, they've laid everything, their entire lives on doing well in this particular class. Like, we really have to understand the causal structure that would have led that individual to commit that error in judgment. And so as a culture, I think, shifting that emphasis, not on the individual, but on, what is that individual a product of? And, I think that focusing on the individual has consequences for defensiveness and a lack of desire to really see how one's behaviors are impacting those around them and even their own lives.
That reminds me, actually, I used to work in a hospital, and Jacob would come around the Joint Commission for Accreditation. And when something went wrong, what they would call a sentinel event, a medical event that caused some harm to a patient, they wanted to find out what the cause of that was. And one of the primary things that they did was to not put blame on an individual.
Oh, good.
Because when you do that, basically the reason goes underground.
Right.
Right. So it's like nobody's going to get punished for this, but it's beyond policy. It's actually required because it's more important that we learn what is wrong with the system that is causing this problem or this dishonesty. We can talk about banking systems or whatever, people taking money off the top of whatever. You want to find out what is the systemic problem and fix that.
Right, fix the process that would have led to that, as opposed to it being a personal.
Right, because I mean, so one person maybe gets away with it, quote unquote, but if you fix the system, you're going to have less dishonesty or less cheating going on in the future. So from a societal benefit, you get more bang for your buck, a lot more bang for your buck, and then you're also teaching everybody what are the better things. Let's take this on the opposite now. What can we do to increase altruism and to increase more moral behavior?
I think that one of the things that we could do is to help individuals come to the terms that they don't have this extreme need to fit in with what everybody else is doing. That peer pressure of telling, if you have to be this way, or you have to do this certain way of behavior, or you have to do this, or you're not going to be accepted into society. I think that as far as what we could do is to teach, like, our children how to think for themselves more, instead of listening to everything society says is right or wrong, but being able to come up with it on their own and be able to think and analyze these situations for themselves, so that they're not so worried about what other people are doing and they're more worried about themselves and what they really believe and feel as an individual.
So kind of bouncing off of that, knowing that we are naturally deceitful, I mean, like the baby crying at 3 months, kind of, the more we focus on just that inner thing and not listening to what's going on around us, the more we're susceptible to our selfishness, I guess, and what will benefit me more than, or more just in life. I think that, are we asking about a solution for moral, or just?
Yeah, I mean, what sort of strategies would you think would help people be more moral than?
Right. So just even subtracting the Bible from the equation, it would be, which is something that the Bible actually states quite a bit is to be kind and to love everyone else, love others more than yourself. If people started to do that, I think that we would have a kinder society. Unfortunately, we have too many people who are very in love with themselves. There's no way to benefit everybody else.
So that matches what you said before. Basically,
Right.
it's awareness of other people's perspective and consideration for others.
Right.
Yeah, where I believe that people need to be responsible for themselves and for their own moral compass, what guides them. Because that's basically what we all are guided by anyway, no matter what moral compass is applied to us or told that we're right, that's right or wrong, we're still going to go by our own moral judgment. Even if it's in secret, we're going to do that. So if we teach our children how to use their own moral judgment to know, hey, I'm doing wrong, and I know this is wrong, and I feel it's wrong, and it doesn't matter if other people are saying it's okay to do that. It's morally wrong because I feel it is, or it's morally right and everybody else is wrong. That kind of feeling or that thought. So
just a little adding to that. So in a godless society where there is no creation and we've kind of just adapted, what is the oh shoot, I lost my train of thought.
I think where you're headed, we're probably going to have to say that for the morality discussion. Because I think that's going to put us solidly into that territory.
Okay.
So come up with the question, bring it back in 2 months.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question? So it was about how to extend
Yeah, what do you think we
altruism?
could do to create more moral behavior, to encourage, consciously or unconsciously, better practices, more moral behavior?
Okay.
Well, I was thinking about the old concept of sensitivity training, where people not dialoguing but multi-logging to where whole groups talking about their feelings and their ideas and kind of becoming sensitive to the other's perspective, I think might help to make us less selfish and more oriented towards a diversity of opinion and a diversity of feelings and a diversity of ambitions and barriers that everyone has. That was one thought.
So I actually agree. I agree with you. Not actually, I agree with you. I think that if we're talking about expanding who we're altruistic towards and how frequently we're altruistic, I think that one thing that we can do is actually not focus on the individual, but focus on how we are so dependent on other people. I try to explain this to my students because they think, it's we think that we understand everything a lot better than we do. And that we're perfectly capable of living our lives as individuals and alone in isolation. But the truth is that throughout our everyday existence, we're completely dependent on people we don't even know. I could not fix my toilet. I could not build my own computer. I don't even know how to sew my own clothes. I definitely don't deliver my own mail. I don't put out the fires in my neighborhoods, and I don't enforce the laws. I'm entirely dependent in some very childlike ways for other people that I will never meet. In order to keep me safe. And so regardless really of what, their background is, their ethnic background, their political background, their religious background, I'm dependent on them, and they don't know me and I don't know them. And so I think just having an awareness that we know very little of what we actually think we know, just sitting down and thinking through how all these things work, I think is a very good exercise in that. I definitely, I'm calling a plumber. I'm not changing my own tire, right? And we are fundamentally, dependent on other people. And so I think that just really understanding that and living that every day helps us be kinder to them because we don't know what they do for us, the everyday person that we meet. And so I think that's one way that we can, extend altruism is really help each other understand that about our lives. The other thing that I just wanted to comment on, so in terms of defining something like deceit, deceit is the intentional misleading of another person. We really don't actually see that until around age 4, because in order to intentionally deceive other people, you have to have an understanding of their mental states. You have to understand what their beliefs and feelings and ideas are. And it's not really until around age 4 that children start to become really good at that. And so deceit is something that becomes more sophisticated and more common with time. I wouldn't want to say that. I would just be cautious as to say, calling certain things deceit without really asking ourselves whether or not that individual knows enough to be, deceptive.
It occurs to me that I'm going to back this off a little bit, because that question had a bit of an assumption in it, which is that altruism is a good thing. If you look at libertarian perspectives and opinions and Ayn Rand's objectivism, the idea is that altruism itself is a weakness, and possibly a more productive or better balanced society is one where people compete, and the natural balance that results of that, which is kind of the Adam Smith's model of economics, is better. So is altruism really something that should be? I mean, it's one thing to say altruism, and it's another thing to say collectively more moral behavior. I don't know, any thoughts on that?
As far as that concept, I'm thinking it brings back memories of that TV show, where they go and they demon hunting. I can't remember the name of the show. I only watched it a few
Supernatural?
times. Supernatural, that's the one. Okay, on Supernatural, they actually believe they're killing demons by killing people. To them, they believe they're doing the right thing. From my perspective, if that was real at all, a real show, and if that show was in real life, that would not be good, would it? So they believe they're doing something right. They believe they're doing something good. So that's altruism to me. And it's not always the right thing. That's my take on it.
So collectively though, would it result in a better outcome?
If people weren't altruistic?
Right. If we had more of a let competitive behavior, just sort of have at it, and collectively it will work. It will work itself out for greater benefit.
I would agree with that.
Well, generally speaking, for example, let's take an example of our current president, Mr. Trump, who is extremely competitive and ambitious and aggressive. He is altruistic with his family. He is very protective of his family. So we see these odd mixtures in people, maybe not so odd in people, and to lesser degrees in all of us.
So I don't think that competition negates altruism. I think that in many respects we could see competition as being altruistic. Presumably you're competing for one's in-group. And that in-group may only consist of you and your immediate family, or that in-group consists of you, your immediate family, and extended family, or you, your immediate family, and friends that are fictive kin. And so I don't know that competition negates altruism. I think in some sense we can even call competition altruistic. Usually competition is, for the sake of, compiling resources for one's in-group. And again, that I don't know what one's in-group would be, but so I think that it's important not to see those things as inherently separate. The other thing is that in order to compete, you still need others. And so I call this the illusion of independence. And so in order to compete and be independent, you still need others to help you be independent. And so we're still a social species. And so at some point you're still, you learned how to compete from somebody else. That's you were being social by learning how to compete from someone else, right? So there's still an inherent sociality to that. So I guess I'll just leave it there, but you can ask me follow-up questions if you want.
My question, the one I have left, will change the subject, so.
Go for it.
Okay, in the segment that they are showing on the Truth About Lies, they were just showing the segment where the children were going and getting their papers, their stationery on the honor system. Do you believe that the honor system works, and why?
Well, I think in that experiment, it didn't at first. And then the kids had to be told that, this is affecting us and our future. By you guys taking these things and not putting in the money for it, we are going to lose this kind of system, or it's not benefiting anybody, it's hurting us. Then the kids thought, okay, this is hurting us. And then it started working.
So without the actual explanation of what it does to them, it wouldn't have worked had they not explained it.
Right. So I don't believe that works naturally. It has to be, people have to see the consequences of it, or realize that there are those consequences before something will work that way. Which kind of, I guess, negates it.
Yeah, I found it interesting that the honor system, the way he was describing it was using the honor system reveals the amount of cheating that he was finding in his studies. But then there were some tools that he had developed and tested that were somewhat successful. It was like reminding people of morality before the tests. One thing was using the Ten Commandments, reciting the Ten Commandments was one example. From a business side, they would have people sign policy statements that says, "I will be a good employee" or whatever. And it turned out to be more detailed than that, because they found that the results of those were very short-lived. It was even down to the point where if someone signed at the bottom, like of a tax paper, that yes, I have told the truth, that was ineffective. But when they signed that on the top of the paper before they fill it out, it was effective. So there was the devil's in the details on this count.
So it's like that, back to that socially acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So in that circumstance, people, if somebody were to find out that they had cheated or lied or were dishonest, then they would be met with less.
It was keeping it in awareness, but it's once you put it in awareness to honesty is a thing I should be doing. It degrades quickly, like within minutes. So try from a business side, you try to come up with mechanisms that would sort of reinforce it or encourage it, or I don't know. That's where you bring in a business consultant for $150 an hour and come up with these sort of strategies for you.
Yeah.
Anything else before I make a big switch in subject here?
Well, I've often thought about, for example, people who are charitable to something that they belong to. For example, if you're a member of a church that demands that you tithe 10% of your income and you're contributing to your church, but you won't contribute to another church or some other activity. Is that self-interest or is that altruism? So.
But,
I don't have an answer.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
I'm just saying that's a fuzzy line.
I see it as a problem, because you've got, on one hand, you've got these really good concepts of altruism, but on the other hand, when you're doing it exclusively within an in-group, you are then creating an opposite effect to how you react to out-groups.
Yeah.
This is one of the criticisms of Islam. When you read the Quran, it's people will cite very strong comments about how you should help the poor and things like that. And when you look at the detail of it, it's our in-group.
Yeah, well, the
Support
Quran
our
is vast
in-group.
and the Hadith is, 100 times vaster. So, and it says everything.
I know, there's contradictions.
And just kind of
This
going
is-
on that
Oh, go ahead.
tithe thing, I mean, like with the Bible, it mentions to give generously or happily, and if you can't do that, then don't give at all. And so they do expect the churches to use that money to help others again. So in a church aspect, at least from my perspective, giving to that church isn't necessarily saying that I'm helping myself, because that's only going around to others. It's not going to come back to me, kind of thing.
But are they, and this is a very broad question, it's probably denominational too to some degree, are they encouraging to help mostly within the church, within their in
It's
group?
within the missionary
or-
state, the missionary aspect as well, sending people to other countries
Yeah.
and having those funds there for that. And I don't think it specifies to only give to one church in our
Helping
case. It
people
would be
outside
just
also.
helping, yeah.
Okay, okay, I'll leave it at that.
But this is a human bias, so I don't want to I don't want to get into the game of saying one particular religion or denomination does this and another one does this. Coveting one's in group and being altruistic with one's in group is just a human universal. It's a human bias. So everyone is more altruistic with their in group than a perceived out group, and that could be as superficial as being nicer to people who like the same music that you like. Or being nicer to individuals that live in your same neighborhood. It's just a human universal bias that we all share, not of a particular group. Like it's something that we all have.
Okay. I'm going to switch directions a little bit dangerously and get into politics a bit here, because this is important on it. Since we're on the subject of honesty, say since the election, we have the president in office who has basically changed the rules of the game of what is allowed as proper behavior. I mean, historically, there's the politicians always lie thing. We know what spin is. We've seen that our entire lives. Every time there's a debate, you get their team gives you the spin. We know what hyperbole is. Before this administration, we have seen what I put down as unfalsifiable falsehood, which means you could say something was incorrect, but nobody could prove you wrong because there was no evidence of it. That was the line that we stopped at. And when people were caught in lies, they were basically their candidacies would just fall apart. People would no longer accept that. We seem to have crossed that line now. We now have falsifiable falsehoods. It didn't start with this president. It actually started a little bit before that, but where someone will deny saying something, and yet we have video evidence of it. How did we cross this line? I mean, what happened that let us cross this line? It just seems like this is a damaging development for our society.
I avoid political questions. As far as politics go, I don't know when that line was crossed.
Well, I'm not actually asking it sort of I'm trying to stay away from the politics in a little bit and looking at it from the human psychology perspective. How did society get to the point where it now allows this to be
Acceptable? How it allows it to be acceptable?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, I mean, a candidate, say, 2-3 elections ago, would have been done when something like this came out, and now someone got elected by doing these things.
Yeah, I have a totally different opinion regarding politics as far as lying goes, and as far as all this stuff happens. There is so many lies out there about Donald Trump that I can't even sift through and discover what part is true and what part is a lie. Mm-hmm. So I can't even comment on, how this would be any different. I mean, it's the way it's gone. I can't even make a decision on who I support.
I think that's part of the problem. I mean, that's one of the outcomes of getting into this fourth dimension, where how are we able to make a judgment?
So again, I think it comes back to self and people seeing what benefits them the most. So as a society, if there's a person there who doesn't have a foundation or some sort of moral foundation, it's kind of subjective and ambiguous. And so I think society has become that way, a bit ambiguous on what truth is. I mean, you hear a lot of people say that truth isn't reality, or I don't know, things have become so subjective, so many play on words now. Who was here the other day? Eric, who said not truth, but something. It's like that, even the word truth is now subjective somehow. So I think the more our foundation kind of moves beneath us, the more people are willing to cross that line into lying and being deceptive or intentionally. So I don't know if that makes sense.
I kind of reacted when you said that it is so much more now than it was then. And while you may well be right, we didn't have the kind of audio and video scrutiny then that we did now. So they may not have been as honest then as, we ascribe to George Washington.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fair point.
Yeah.
Fair point.
Or honest Abe.
Or honest Abe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know that we have, someone probably does somewhere. Some historian or group of historians probably has some kind of data that would tell us whether or not lying or public dishonesty has increased. I personally don't have that information. But I would, so I agree with you. I don't know if it's increased. But what has changed is the availability of information. And so we have audio recording, we have the internet, we have so much information. So I think really what this issue boils down to in part is a misunderstanding of what counts as evidence and a misunderstanding of, as a scientist, a misunderstanding of what scientists consider enough evidence or a convergence of evidence. And I think that it's very hard for individuals, I find difficulty in this as well, to make sense and sift through information online. What is true, what isn't, what counts as evidence, what doesn't. And I don't think it's just politicians. I think it's all media that we're exposed to. It's very, very difficult to understand if a news story that we just read on a Facebook feed is actually something that's real in the world. Is this video actually depicting what these individuals are interpreting it as depicting? I think that fake news is rampant, and I don't know if it's any different now than it was before, or if we just now have the ability to refute it. But I think in part it boils down to not understanding what counts as good evidence, what counts as bad evidence, and how we delineate between the two.
So given that from the psychological studies that I've read, where people tend to reinforce their own intuitions, how can we, I just think of the average voter just looking at both sides of anything and saying, I don't know what's true. It's like having two economists that with Nobel Prizes saying do this, and the other one says do that, and then the person who's trying to go out and vote for some proposition has no clue. How do we deal with that these days? Because this is going to be something that basically future generations from now forward are going to have to do. The internet is not going away. You can support any position.
With skepticism, I guess. When reading a story or an interpretation of a finding, thinking to yourself, do I think this is true because I want it to be true? And is that, what else can I learn about this particular thing? And that makes living life very difficult, because if you're going to live your daily life always questioning everything and wanting more information, then that becomes so tiresome. And who wants to be chronically insecure about how to live their life? But I do think that when it comes to important decision making, even like voting in elections or voting on propositions, that it's important to question why I reject something or why I'm so for something. And that's the intuitive part. So this sounds good, so I'm gonna believe that what they're saying is the true thing. And experiencing that, stopping, and really trying to understand why your initial reaction was that, and just trying to learn more. I don't know. I think it's a very difficult task. And I don't know that we have good mechanisms for solving it, because I think that it's moving faster than we can control it.
Yeah, and thinking back to the Bush administration, Bush 2, weapons of mass destruction, did they or did they not initially believe that there were weapons of mass destruction, number one? At some point, they realized, but they still maintained there were no weapons of mass destruction. They had to frame our goodness in going in and democratizing the Arab world by making us the good guys, So there were a lot of lies inherent in this, and some of them they were lying to themselves, maybe, and some of them they maybe knew they were not lying to themselves. But that is pretty much fundamental in how politics and how nation leading goes. I mean, you,
Well,
you
but that
don't
was an unfalsifiable statement at that point in time.
initially.
Yeah, that's true. When they
Yeah,
were selling
yeah.
initially, yeah.
Yeah, initially, yeah. And what about telling troops who are losing the war that they're losing the war? I mean, of course they falsify. Of course they tell them they're winning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's part of politics and nation leading.
See, that brings me back to that segment on the creative dishonesty where the guy was going to do the marketing for that blogger who wrote that book, and they wanted to create controversy and to create a higher to improve their stats or whatever, to improve their purchases of the book, to sell what he was selling. And they use things like fake emails to trick people into linking about them and creating controversy because it drives the sales. Remember, they put the posters up that were horrible and had a bad message to incite a riot, basically, inside of you, to inspire that emotional, controversy within yourself and what you stand for and what you don't. I see a lot of that today in our social, political campaigns that regarding this, with Trump and this election. So that brings me all back to that. So I'm kind of thinking that we kind of look at things that we'll get pieces of lies, and instead of checking the facts on what's being said, we sit there and think, oh, I like what they're saying, I agree with this. So then they jump on a bandwagon and they accept it as truth, even though it's a lie. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we have, and one of the things that could solve it is if everybody stepped back and as they looked for the truth in all of it, or for the facts, that if they just step back and do the fact checking, it could help minimize some of that.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
Not really. I'm not sure that so you were mentioning propositions that, people don't know what to think, or how do we...
Well, when you've got two sides that you've got no way to swing one way or the other because the facts have been sort of messed up so much in the media. I like I say, we've gone to the point of falsifiable truths being lied about.
Right, but I mean, just looking
and
at...
that's being reinforced by everybody listening to their own media. So
Right, so avoid the media.
Avoid the media.
Because the government, when I was
well,
this last election, I remember sitting down, getting on government websites and actually reading some of these propositions that were coming out, and then going onto the actual candidate websites, looking at the plans they actually printed out on there. That seems more, because then you can actually look at what they have there, what they're saying they're going to do, as opposed to what they're saying on TV, which will differ, since they're getting more views, I'm sure, on TV than they are online. So I didn't struggle with understanding what was going on or feel like I was in some whirlwind. So I feel like we should give people a little more credit, and I think that if they do just utilize those sources online, you can find out
credit
credit
for finding what is correct.
Right, like what the actual proposition does do, and then, I mean, I think there are like pros and cons for each of them.
Yeah.
It's I don't know, I thought it was easy to find. So
That's true, and in terms of the California propositions, I think it's a good model.
Right.
For those who aren't familiar with it, you get a pro, you get a con, and each side gets a rebuttal.
Right.
So you do kind of you can sort of see where the biases are a little bit that way.
Right.
Okay, any final statements before we move on to Q&A? I want to kind of have a good Q&A today. Anything left out?
No, I think I...
No? Okay. Okay, well, thank you all. This is interesting, it's important. We've got a couple of interesting ones coming up the next couple of months, so check us out for that. We've got the shifting demographics of secularization in the country, and then we're going to have that morality discussion that I've referred to a couple of times here. So let's take a break, and then we'll come back with the Q&A. Thank you, everybody.
All right.